Okay, so this is the latest instalment in the Range Rover restoration. Doesn't look much like a Range Rover, but there's quite a few nuts and bolts here of a Range Rover. And what I'm basically doing is salvaging what I can and replacing where I need to. So obviously if there's a bolt head that's corroded or a thread that's destroyed, then I'll replace. But in the cases of a lot of these things, as you can see, the bolt is perfectly serviceable. A quick clean of the thread, and the bolt head is good and it's the right specification, then there's no point spending good money to replace that, so they just need cleaning up. All of these bolts in here that I've got are from the front and rear hubs as I disassembled the axles, and over here we've got the front axle casing, which is completely stripped down and just been painted with Rust Buster 1-to-1 epoxy chassis paint, but it came out really nicely actually. So next thing really is to rebuild the axle. Now there's not an awful lot of reasons why I wouldn't want to reuse these bolts, as long as the threads are good, and these ones for instance are the brake caliper bolts. The threads look clean, they just need a bit of a brush up. The edges on the bolt head are in good shape. They've obviously been undone using a correct tool rather than a larger socket just hammered over it. And what I've basically done here is I've categorised these into different bolts. So here we've got all of the bolts that secure the drive plates or the drive shafts to the hub. Then here I've got the rear caliper bolts and the front caliper bolts. They're slightly different in that the amount of thread you've got on the end here. Now I don't know if that's critical or not, but you notice this one's got thread to about halfway down the shank, and that one's got it to only about a third of the way down. So I'm keeping them separate, recording them. These fellas over here, can't remember, but they're all the same thing. We've got the bump stop bolts for the front hubs. We've got other bolts and bits and bobs here. So they're all categorised. These little fellas at the end here are the ones that secure the ring onto ring onto the back of the hub itself, the securing ring, sealing ring. So what I do after I've cleaned all these fellas, to clean them up, is I need to measure these things. So give me 1 second. Right, so what I tend to do here is measure thread, measure bolt diameter, use taps and dies. Dies obviously to clean the thread on the bolts, taps if I need to clean up nuts or clean up threads in housings, and then this whole lot will then be fit for service again. So if we take, let's say, a brake caliper bolt. Stand up, it will. Get these fellas, these are called thread gauges, they're called drill gauges. That's a thread gauge. These are called drill gauges, really useful for calculating the diameter of a bolt. You buy them on eBay, they're about a tenner for a pair. This one's Imperial, it's got the Imperial measurements on it. I tend to be a bit of an old fart, tends to work with a mixture of Imperial and metric. Metric's obviously dead easy, it's all in millimetres. Imperial is in fractions of an inch. So what we do is we find the bolt goes through, just fits through the correct hole, and it just doesn't fit through that one, but it does fit through that one. So 7/16. So the bolt is 7/16. I need to work out the thread pitch. So you use one of these little chaps. Although this one is one I've had since I was about 18, maybe 17, came in this tap and die set, which I've had since I was 17 or 18, and it has served me well. There's a mixture on here, on the front it will tell you what it does. So it's a mixture of metric and fine and pipe wrenches, but there is some coarse in here as well. So what we've got is the metric sizes, M3, M4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, and then we've got the fines, the 18, 1/8, sorry, the 5/32, and so forth. Really good. 1/8 BSP is quite useful for pipe. Now, I tend to supplement this kit. I've got thousands of bloody taps and dies now. But this little thing here, I digress somewhat, is the really useful thing for measuring the number of threads we've got per inch, which is critical to this particular bolt, or critical to measuring a bolt. So, we'll start with 20, because it looks like quite a coarse thread. And that fits more or less exactly on there. You can normally guess what the threads are. This is an Imperial bolt. It's old school, it's Land Rover, it's going to be quite a coarse thread. So that is a 7/16 bolt with 20 threads per inch. Have we got 7/16? We have down here, faded 7/16 20. So what we then do, slide it off, find the tap that says 7/16 20. That's ½ inch. Might not be in here, of course. I'll try not to mix them up too much. There it is. So what we've got is this die, so 7/16 NF20. And all I then do, not over the box, it just fills the box up with shit, is I try and wind this on by hand. The reason I tend not to use the handles and things is because sometimes you don't really want to be cutting a thread, you want to be cleaning a thread. However, it's going. So I'm holding the die in my hand, so if it starts to hurt I know I'm putting too much torque on it, and I am now just winding the bolt through up to the shank. There it is, up to the shank. It's not going to go any further. If I go any further it will start cutting the thread, and then we'll wind it off. Bomb, bomb. And this is all done dry, and there is the cleaned bolt. Now next I need to clean up the hole it's going into on the hub. So 1 second. Okay, so out of the box I found myself a nice tap. This one says on it 7/16 NF20. I don't know if this thing focuses or not. I can't see past it, and those are the best of times doing it. Here's the hub. Obviously it's off the car at the moment, quite obviously, and the caliper mountings are here and here. As you can see, I painted this thing, so there's a reasonable chance there'll be some gank in those threads. So the idea is we wind the tap into the hole and it cuts the thread. Now, it's going to be a bit on the tight side because there is paint in there, epoxy paint. I've got the handle, T-handle. This isn't the one that came with the kit. This is one I found at a vintage antiques fair and haggled the bloke nice and hard. But I love collecting this old stuff. Old school engineering stuff is really great. So it's always worth keeping an eye out for this kind of stuff. So we put the T-bar on the tap, we wind it in. It doesn't matter if you're using a standard tap, a second tap, taper tap, or a second tap, or a bottom tap. It doesn't matter because we're going right the way through anyway. I mean, typically what would happen is a taper tap you would use if you were going right through something. A bottom tap, obviously, if you are just working in a hole with a bottom end on it. So the idea of a bottom tap is it's got a square edge to the end of it, so it taps right to the bottom of the hole. Second taps are often quite useful for cutting things, I guess, but quite nicely. And look at the pile of crap underneath there. So all of that crap has come out of that hole. So now, when I wind this out, it comes out nicely. Again, done this dry. Oops, we're not quite straight, are we? Never mind. It happens. That comes out of there. I'm wearing blue gloves because I'm fed up with oily hands. Don't want to drop these because they're made out of fairly fragile steel, hence the sharpness of them. Yeah, it's looking out nice and clean. And the bolt now will go in. Now I appreciate I'm winding this in the wrong way round. It doesn't matter. I can wind that in by hand. There's a clean thread on both the bolt and the hole. Just probably didn't do it before. I will try and screw the same bolt into the hole on the other side. And I can't even get the damn thing started, to be honest. Let's try it on the correct side. There's the correct side. No, it's not going to go in. So we do that as well. Trusty tap back. Trusty tap. And this one, as you see, this isn't a bottom tap. It's got a slight taper, it's what I call a second tap. It's got a slight taper on the end. So the idea is that it goes into the hole, centres itself, and then progressively cuts the thread. But because I'm cleaning threads rather than rather than cutting threads, that's perfectly adequate. As you can see, just needs a little bit of pressure. It's got it nice and straight, and because I'm putting minimal torque on this, I can feel if it's going to damage the thread that I've got here. I don't want to damage the thread. Obviously the thread is already there. All I'm doing is cleaning it up, cleaning rust, paint, rubbish, oxidisation, ferrous oxide, brake dust, cleaning all of that rubbish out of the thread. It's almost through. Well, if you lubed it up, you know, I suppose one thing of lubing things up is that you will get the crap, rather than falling out of the bottom here, the crap will stick to the tap. I've always done these things dry, to be honest. So this is the one the bolt wouldn't locate on just now. Clean the top bolt. And now that bolt, look at that! Shit the bed. That goes in right up to its shank. So, quick lesson in bolts. So all I use here, drill gauges to gauge the diameter of the bolts. Quality tap and die set, don't buy cheap crap. This one I've had for thousands of years. Some of this stuff is made out of cheese these days, so the taps are softer than the steel. You don't necessarily want the tap to be harder than the steel when you're cleaning threads, but when you're cutting threads, it's a pain in the arse if you strip the tap or the die. I've had to replace a couple of these over the years, and I've put new ones in the kit, but overall this kit served me well. Mixture of metric and imperial, and it's UNF and UNC, so it's a mixture of UNF and UNC. T-bar, as you see, nice T-bar there, and a thread gauge, which is probably the most important thing I've got. So these dictate, or help me to dictate, what die and tap I need to use. That's it. Let's end it.